Hello, and welcome to another episode of Australian Short Stories. My name is Charlize Abbott Higgins, and today I have a very special episode for you. I will be meeting the narrator himself, the man with all the knowledge, Hans Stegman.
Oops. Finally, nice to meet you.
I know, after all these years.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm ready to learn everything.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Why were American and Canadian prisoners sent to Australia anyways? Like, what was the point of that?
Well, there was a problem. There was in 1837 and 1838, there were two rebellions in Canada. There was actually one in Lower Canada, one in Upper Canada. But the thing is, you've got to be careful, is that unlike Upper being the top one, the upper part of Canada is actually known as the Lower Canada.
Yeah.
And the one closer to the Ontario, onto Lake Ontario, is actually Upper Canada.
Yeah.
So, and both of them were run by two different lieutenant generals,
Okay.
lieutenant governors, who looked after both areas. Now, the French Canadians in the top section, in what's called Lower Canada, were complaining about, there was a depression coming on at the time, and they had to pay money to the landowners and to the stock suppliers and to all the food suppliers, and it got really, really hard to do. But most of the people who were in charge of the supplies of stuff were English owned.
Yeah.
And so therefore they thought they were being biased against, and then when there were increase of prices from England, they thought, hey, hang on, this isn't right.
Oh.
We'll have a bit of a rebellion. We'll have a bit of a
Uprising.
uprising,
Yeah.
and we'll say, hey, come on, this isn't fair. Let's get this done. So roughly about 500 of them wandered down towards, picked up their shovels and picks and what's the names. Half of them didn't have guns; they just wanted to rebel.
Yeah.
And they finally met all the British soldiers who knew they were coming, and they arrested most of them. But of the ones that were arrested, 58 of them were caught in jail and kept in jail for nearly a year in Montreal, to be sent to initially to Bermuda by Lord Dunham, who was in charge. But Bermuda, the guy said, no, we don't want the buggers here. We don't want them here at all.
Yeah.
Get rid of them. Now, at that time, a large percentage of the French Canadians were illiterate, and only a few could speak English, and so there was a bit of a problem, language problems all the time. That was number one. And number two, we had about a year later, we had the same thing. We had the French Canadian, the British Canadians, which the French Canadians called les Anglais, the English. They were homegrown. They decided, we were sick and tired of being the English looking after us. We're going to start our own country. And at the same time, they had some American sympathisers who came across, who were basically mercenaries, came across to help them, thinking, we'll get some money out of this guy. Let's fight these buggers, you know. And so they once again, not really well done in organising things. They were rounded up by the British again. A number of them were killed. A few of them actually, the English used the Indian tribe there to help round them up.
Okay.
But when the Indians saw what the English had done to the American prisoners, they were disgusted by the way they treated them. But at the end of them, there was 84 to 87 of them were put in jail again. So at the time they thought, well, where are we going to send these guys? Now, the Americans first, they came out in 4 ships to Australia, in 4 ships. The first 3 ships were basically 6 of them here, 8 of them there, 10 of them there. But the last ship, called the Buffalo, there was 87 of them, was sent out with the 58 French Canadians from Quebec straight down to Australia.
No.
Now, the governor, and you'll love this, the governor of Upper Canada at the time said, I think I know where to send them. Now, the new governor of the Upper Canada was Sir George Arthur, who had just come from his next position of promotion from being the governor of Tasmania.
Oh.
So, and he knew where to send them. Send them to Port Arthur, or send them to Tasmania. So the boats came through.
Yeah.
They dropped off the 87 to Port Arthur, to Tasmania, and where they were landed.
Yeah.
They were landed off Sandy Bay, where most of them were sent out onto assignments and people outside.
Yeah.
The other 58 were continued on up to Sydney. Now, when they got up to Sydney, the new governor there, Governor, I think it was Gibbs was at the time, said, "Oh, wait, hang on, they're Catholics. They give us problems. We don't want Catholics here. We'll send them to." At that time, Alexander McConaughey had just left Sydney with his troop of people to go to Norfolk Island to start his experiments, which is another story. And Gibbs said, "We'll send them to Norfolk Island." Well, there was a bit of a complaint from the Catholic priest there, who'd been given some information from Quebec that these guys had to be looked after. So he said, "Well, okay, we better keep them here. So we better send them to, we're going to send them. Oh, look, there's a way station halfway between Parramatta and Sydney called Longbottom. We'll send them there. Now, who's going to look after them? Well, they've got to be kept, because they're political prisoners, they've got to be kept separate. So I think we'll get this guy called Batley. He will be, he was part of the engineering department. He will look after the control of them. But the problem with Batley, of course, is that once you are in control of an area where most of the people can't speak English, and you don't want them to go anywhere else, you've got a bit of control over what they want to do. And he was a bit of an entrepreneur. He decided he wanted to make a bit of money himself. So he found out what all these guys did. Now, all the people from the French Canadians weren't, and in most convicts, they weren't just one private people. There were lawyers, there were doctors, there were sawyers, there were carpenters, there were bricklayers. So he used all their expertise to make what he wanted to do, and he got them to make boats and axles and spokes and shoes, which he pinched the timber, the leather from the cattle, from the government cattle, and he used to sell them on the side. Well, also at the same time, they were being fed by the government departments, the government suppliers of meat, etc. Of course, it's a government contract. So what do? You're getting paid good money. So you give the rubbish what you got, you get the good stuff. So of course, though, the French Canadians were not fed too well. So they discovered oysters. And they discovered oysters. So this side, they were collecting oysters, but Batley knew they were doing it, but they had him on the swing, because if they dobbed him in, he could dob them in. As well as the oysters for the thing, and the oyster shells, they also used to make, they used to break rocks for making small things for gravel to make the roads. But also they used to make what they call shingles, which is long slips of pieces of timber to pave the roads in Sydney. Wooden shingles, which is unusual. They also did this in Melbourne. To do that in 1841, they were making shingles to pave Little Bourke Street, which is unusual because of all the mud. It was just mud everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't walk on the stuff. But there was the whole information that I received on this sort of stuff was actually sent to me from the American consul, the Canadian consul actually, who got excited when I wrote him a letter before Google started to find out this. And there's a book called The Land of a Thousand Sorrows by a French called Lapelliere, who documented day-to-day diary for 2 years of what happened at Longbottom, which is fantastic. Now, Longbottom's halfway between as I said before, between Parramatta and Sydney, and it used to be a way station, holding station for the convicts when they were being shipped from one to the other. But Batley, who's in charge, what was very protective, didn't want them to do any other work anywhere else. But Batley had a bit of not a problem. He used to like to visit the ladies in the Parramatta female factory, but also Tarban Creek, which is a lunatic asylum in Sydney, where the first 20 inmates were actually women from Parramatta female factory. Now, at that time, nymphomania was described as a mental disease, and that can be documented. You can read that up. He used to visit the ladies all the time and spend weekends away, and where he unfortunately caught the fatal disease, which ended his life a bit later on in life.
So these, well, now convicts, how badly were they treated? Because you told me what the jobs were for these French Canadian prisoners, but what about the American ones? Like, where did they go and how were they treated throughout this process?
Well, the Americans were a little bit better off as such. They were assigned out, but a couple of them did try to escape. 4 of them escaped, and they were actually sent to Port Arthur for a period of time. There's a couple of other books called, one by Thomas Waite, who was Benjamin Waite, sorry, who was called The Waite Letters, and he wrote a thing. He was one of the leaders of the uprising in America, in the American section. And but he, because they were political prisoners, they had no records of what they should do with them. Franklin was in charge at the time. He didn't know what to do with them. So he let them out a little bit. They didn't have to wear convict clothing, etc. Unlike the French Canadians, who had convict clothing with LB written on the bottom on their clothing, meaning long bottom, which was where they were kept. But Waite and his mate Chandler decided at one stage they were in plain clothing, and within less than a year and a half, or 2 years at the most, he went out so-called fishing with his mate, and when they arranged to pick up an American whaler, where they got on board that, and they had to work their way back to America, so they escaped pretty quickly. But there was another one which is even more interesting. The whole idea of the American uprising, once again, was that actually had a ship in just up from Niagara Falls, called Navy Island, and the ship was called the Caroline. And the English guys had got a hold of the ship, cut it adrift, killed one person who happened to be a black watchmaker, and sent the boat over the Niagara Falls. So the whole ship on fire and set it over Niagara Falls, where of course it was destroyed. But anyway, it's just interesting stuff. But it's still called Miller. Linus Miller was once again, he wrote a book on an exile to Van Diemen's Land. That also is a very big good if you want to read it about what happened and things. He was down at, when he arrived on the Buffalo, which was the 87, which they turned up, they were all confronted by Franklin, who stood them up, and Franklin was a big boy. He was a big guy. And he said, "Oh, you Americans, the French Canadians not going to understand because they are illiterate and stupid people." He said they would have been easily confused by other people. "But you Americans," he said, you are traitors to your country." He said, and you know what better. And as for you, Miller, as a 23-year-old lawyer, you should know better. I'm going to make an example of you. And of course, they all thought, how could the nephew of our founder treat as such? I couldn't work this out for a while. And then I twigged. They thought that Sir John Franklin was Benjamin Franklin's nephew.
What?
And Benjamin Franklin was the founder of America, of course.
Oh.
Which I had a really good look at, and of course it wasn't. That's true. But anyway, Miller misbehaved a bit, and he was sent to Port Arthur for 2 years, where he was actually part of his work was actually on the Caterpillar, which was our first story that we talked about, where he had to be with 25 or 50 other people, had to carry logs out of the bushes out into the thing to perhaps maybe make timber for the railroad that we spoke at in the very first one we did. Because at the time, the gentleman in charge was the instigator of the railroad manufacturing.
Yeah.
He was complaining how they used to they used to get wet in their clothing, and they had to, when they had back to their cells, they had to sleep in their wet clothing. So no wonder people got sick and died, etc. But he had a very, very good, but interesting thing. But there's a little funny stories coming through. Now, Waite at the time, the first guy again, he was actually were given the rights of being the watchman for one night outside this building, etc. But he had arranged with two of his other American guys inside to try and escape up the chimney. So he was up on the roof there as a watchman. He's supposed to be out. This is about 3 o'clock in the morning or something. He was up on the roof in the morning, and he'd let it down a rope, and one of the guys was climbing up the chimney from inside. But the chimney narrowed a bit, and he was a little bit overweight. And he got stuck halfway up the chimney. And of course, all the burning, the red embers down below were heating his bottom a bit. So he was screaming, he was yelling at the guy. So they let go of the rope. So he fell down, landed on hot coals, burnt his bum. Quickly, had a bit of a yell, scream, and everyone else in the room said, "What's going on?" But they quickly rolled in the corner very quietly. And Waite went down got off the chimney to him and yelled out, 4 o'clock and all's well.
Oh no.
So
oh, I couldn't imagine. That's awful. When did that start? Like, what time around is this? Like, where are we in the timeline?
well, about 1841.
Okay. So what time about did they start going home? Did any of them make it home to where they started?
Because they were not really being looked after too well by the American government, a lot of them went to what they call the Sandwich Islands, which was Hawaii. Hawaii was called the Sandwich Islands before then. So a number of them, a few of them escaped, a few of them went to the mainland, and it wouldn't surprise me that some didn't get back to about 1846, but when gold was discovered in Australia in 1850, it wouldn't surprise me if some of them actually came back for the gold fields at some stage. But a lot of the French Canadians could only go back if they could pay their own way.
Which they definitely couldn't.
They couldn't.
They absolutely couldn't.
Well, the guy called John McLean was the principal secretary, was the principal overseer of convicts, and he was a very nice guy. And he actually got jobs for 19 of the 58 French Canadians, and employed 2 of them for his own place, against Bradley's wishes, because he wanted all the convicts to work for him and his mates, and when they were very badly treated. So it's an interesting sort of part. It's interesting part. The two together, if you're interested in reading more, some of the books I have unfortunately are no longer available, but look them up. I said the Waite Letters, The Land of 1,000 Sorrows, and An Immigrant's Time in Van Diemen's Land by Miller. So it's quite interesting. Any others? Question you want to know? That one?
Oh dear, I didn't get the last question. I've forgotten it already. I was too interested and I've forgotten it. Last one.
So things aren't as normal as people think. They're not as cut and dried as a lot of people think.
There's so much that is just not told. Like so many things. The fact that I didn't even know that there were American and Canadian prisoners that were convicts at Australia and were sent there to do work just like British ones, like that's not something anyone's ever told, you know?
Yeah, well, it's everywhere. I mean, the British were everywhere and they shipped people around the world, but a lot of the time they sent people back to a central court, as it were. As I was saying before, when we had, there was a gentleman court in Auckland who was sent to Sydney for trial. They didn't have a court there in New Zealand at the time. So it's there's more to it than a lot of people think. There's a lot more to it, and it's the more you read, the more you find that you don't know.
Well, if these people have been sent to Australia, have there been ever, like, I don't know, politicians that have been sent, like, as prisoners to Australia?
Well, actually, in most of the world, there was also the Scottish, apparently, Ted Potterton, they call it. I haven't got it on them yet, but there were Scots as well.
Yeah.
We also had the Fenians. There was a group of Fenians, which are Irish, and that was one of the outrageous escapes of all time. They were actually in Perth, West Australia, in the 1860s later on. And they'd arranged, apparently it was about 8 of them, I think it was, they'd arranged, but 2 of them were in jail, so only 6 got away. They'd arranged with an American whaling ship to pick them up, and they had 2 undercover guys turned up there and work on the side with them to try and arrange their escape. And they actually got it and they rowed this bloody boat out to the American ship, and with the English chasing them completely. And when they got the ship, the British said, "Stop all fire," and the American guy yelled out, "Do you want to start another English war again?" They got away. Got away to So I think they were financed by the Irish in America.
What?
It's so much funny stories. We look at it now and think it's funny, but at this time it was quite. You had to do what you could do.
Yeah.
You had to do it. It was just to survive. And a lot of the supplies of food and things like that were the contractors, once again, make money themselves, keep the good stuff themselves, sell the rubbish to the convicts. Because they're only convicts. Don't worry about it. Convicts. Who cares?
Yeah.
But all the convicts that we had, they didn't just come from England. They came from everywhere. They came from Barbados, they came from Bermuda, they came from Jamaica, they came from Canada. Because if they were convicted of something and they were in England, they're sent back to England for trial. We just send them from there. You wouldn't send them back to Barbados.
Send them to Australia.
Send them to Australia.
Yeah.
Initially, they sent them to America.
Yeah.
So until the American Revolution, America used to get the convicts.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people didn't realise either.
Yeah.
That was the first point. Because there was, after the war, the Napoleonic War, all these people turned up back and there was no jobs for them. And of course then they turned to crime. And because there was no food.
Yeah, so they had to do that.
Yeah, and then, God, what do we do with them? We've got no jails anymore, we'll put them onto prison hulks, which was one of our early stories. That's right. And then after the prison hulks, oh God, where do we send them now? Oh, hang on, we've got to find somewhere for them. And then they decided, well, we'll send them away to Australia.
It seems like Australia was the worldwide dumping ground.